Welcome to English 2450, COM 2010, Intro to Film, Week 6, lecture video number 3. This is part of the series on cinematography, and in this video I'm going to start talking about how cinematographers are able to frame the image, the importance of framing the image. So let's start with a definition of framing. Framing is the process by which the DP, the cinematographer, determines what will appear within the borders of the image during a shot. And the frame defines the image, right? This is an important thing to keep in mind, is that the frame, right, this here, the frame, the thing along the edge, is not a neutral border, but it's incredibly important. What we see within the frame, what's not seen in the frame, what happens off of the frame, the edge of the frame, how the frame might move, are all incredibly important to film, right? Remember, film and cinematography are writing in motion. An important part of motion is where and when and how that motion occurs. So framing is the process by which the DP determines what will appear within the borders of the image, within the frame. Now, framing has 4 different kind of important components. It can affect the image by the size and the shape of the frame. What does the frame actually look like? The way the frame defines on and off screen space, right? What happens on the screen, what happens off of the screen. The way that the frame imposes the distance, the angle, and the height of the camera, right? The frame tells us where the camera is, what angle it's at, and how high up it is. The frame tells us quite a bit about what the camera is doing. And then the 4th piece of this puzzle is the way that the frame can move in relation to what is being filmed. Now, this is called mobile framing. So we know when we're watching a film that the frame, right, is not always still. It moves around, right? And this has been the case for a long time, right? In very, very early filmmaking technology, cameras were so large and bulky and heavy that you could only sit the camera down and film what was right in front of it. But as soon as a more portable handheld version of the camera was created, which was pretty early on in like maybe the 1910s, then mobile framing became a possibility because the camera can move, therefore the frame created by the camera can also move. So in this video, I'm going to start talking about framing. Framing is kind of a big and complex topic, so I'm probably going to have to break this into a couple different videos, so stay tuned for part 2 of framing. So let's start with the size and the shape of the frame. Now, when I refer to the size and the shape of the frame, really what we're talking about here is something called aspect ratio. Now, aspect ratio is probably a term you've heard before, and maybe you never really understood exactly what it was or how it worked. But this is the ratio of the frame's width, right, left to right, to the frame's height, top to bottom. And this has changed over time from a more square-shaped to a more rectangular shape, aspect ratio. So aspect ratio is when you take the width of an image versus the height of an image, right? And over time, films have gone from being more square to more rectangular. Now, widescreen images are typically 1 to 85 to 1. And this is typically created using what's called as masking. If you look at this image here on the left, for example, these black bars at the bottom and the top of the frame create a kind of widescreen image. The screen is wide, this is the image, this is the ratio of 1 to 85. And then another way that a widescreen image can be created is through an anamorphic process where a special lens squeezes the image, right? So this here is a chart of different aspect ratios that have been used over time. 1 to 33, which is called Academy. Aperture early widescreen was 1 to 65. Current widescreen is more like 1 to 85. You get even kind of more like wide and rectangular, like Cinerama, for example, is even wider than what we consider typical kind of American widescreen. And you'll see that over the history of film production and projection, you move from a more kind of square, traditional, to a more rectangular, right? And if you think about the evolution of the television, right, as one kind of example here, TVs have moved from being more kind of square and boxy to, you know, flat screen rectangles too. So of course that affects the shape of the frame. The shape of the frame is affected by the aspect ratio of how the film is going to be projected, because back when films were more kind of square and the screen was more kind of square, that does affect what you see within and without the frame. So aspect ratio is important, and widescreen versus full screen is actually an important distinction because, it does kind of cut off the image in a different way and create a different frame. So I'm not going to expect you to remember different types of the specific aspect ratios. Like I won't ask you, is widescreen 165 or 185? The important thing to remember is that the frame is altered by size and shape, right? And that we've shifted over time from a square type of frame to a more rectangular widescreen type of frame as being the most typical aspect ratio that's used in Hollywood filmmaking now. So this is an example of older to newer aspect ratios. And also an important thing to remember is that idea of masking, right? Using these black bars at the top and the bottom to create a widescreen image. Another important term here is frame within a frame within a frame. So the first frame is the frame of the image, right? The square edges of the screen. The second frame here is the leg, right? This is an image from the film The Graduate. The woman is trying to seduce him, so she's got her leg kind of propped up, and we see the character within this frame. So frame within a frame is when the DP specifically creates two frames, the edge of what the camera can see, and then a frame within that. So if a character is looking through a window or into a mirror, that's often a frame within a frame as well. Now, another important piece of framing, in addition to the shape and the size of the frame, is how the frame defines on-screen space and off-screen space. Now, the way that this works, right, is that we as the audience assume that the space we are shown on the screen is a continuous space. That if the camera moves, it pans or it tilts or whatever, right? The person holding the camera gets up and walks around, that we'll see the rest of the space. We expect that it is continuous, right? We expect that if the camera pans to one side, we'll see the rest of the living room or whatever it is that we're looking at. Because we assume that, directors and DPs can do interesting things with on and off screen space because they know that their audience will assume that something connected to the narrative could potentially be happening off screen. So that tension between what we see and what we don't see can help develop the narrative and create suspense. Think about the last horror movie you saw. And if it's a well-directed and well-shot horror movie, it's going to make use of that off-screen space, the thing just outside the frame that you can't quite see, to create suspense, to create horror, the horror of the unknown, the horror of the unseen, right? So the DP, if they're doing a good job, can use that on-screen space and off-screen space to create tension. The frame cuts off. What we want to see is just over here, but we can't quite see it because the camera's not going to show it. So there are 6 zones of off-screen space: to the left of the frame, to the right of the frame, above the frame, what's happening up here, below the frame, behind the camera, and behind the set. Now, the first 4 are pretty straightforward. You turn your head to the left, you turn your head to the right, you tilt your head up, you tilt your head down. Those are the 6 zones of, are the first 4 of the 6 zones of off-screen space. The last 2 are a little bit more complicated, behind the camera and behind the set. So I have an image here, and hopefully it's pretty visible. And this right here is an example of a shot from a film, right? So this is what we're seeing on the film. It's 2 characters sitting on other sides of the table from each other, and in the background we see a window and a door, right? If the camera tilts over or pans over here, then we know what's to the left of the screen. If the camera pans over here, we know what's to the right. If the camera tilts up, we know what's above. If the camera tilts down, we know what's below. And then when we say what's behind the camera, we mean what's in front of the characters here. So if the camera is here and the thing being filmed is here, this would be behind the camera, this general direction. And back through this door would be behind the set. So we have to remember that this is a 3-dimensional space, right? And in a 3-dimensional space, a character could get up and they could move this way, they could move this way, they could move up, they could move down, they could move back, and they could move forward, right? So remember that anything you see on screen is a three-dimensional space, and that means that they can move up, down, left, right, behind the camera or behind the set. That's a little bit complicated, but it's an important thing to remember because of the way that directors manipulate on-screen space and off-screen space using that frame as an edge that dictates what we can see and what we can't see. So these are all things to keep in mind as we're watching this week's film, which is a horror film. How does the DP use that off-screen space to build tension, to make us ask questions, to help develop the narrative? In the next video, I'll be talking a little bit more about the next couple elements of framing, which are camera distance, height, and angle, as well as mobile framing. So stay tuned for that.